Have you ever experienced a time in your life when you felt that God was silent during your most difficult moments? You prayed earnestly, sought answers with all your heart, and longed for God's presence, but in the end, it seemed like He wasn't responding. Many people have gone through moments where it felt like God was absent, especially when facing trials, doubts, or confusion. These moments can be deeply unsettling, causing feelings of frustration, doubt, and even isolation. It's natural to wonder why, during times of struggle, God appears to be silent. But what if I told you that God's silence doesn't mean He's absent? What if, in reality, it's a way that God is drawing us closer to Him, refining our faith, and preparing us for something greater ahead? In this video, we'll dive into this concept of God's silence and understand how, even in those quiet moments, He is still at work in our lives. The focus of this topic is to explore the idea that God's silence is not the same as His absence. Silence, especially in spiritual contexts, can be a way that God communicates with us. It's a form of spiritual communication that's meant to deepen our trust in Him, to strengthen our faith, and to prepare us for what lies ahead. In times when we don't hear God's voice or receive immediate answers, it's easy to assume He's distant or uninterested in our struggles. However, God often uses these moments to refine our hearts and develop our patience and trust in His timing. In various parts of the Bible, we see that silence is used by God as a powerful tool. Silence doesn't mean He's left us. Rather, it's often during these times of quiet that He's doing the most significant work in our lives, even if we don't immediately see or understand it. Think for a moment, have you ever had a time in your life when you felt that God was silent? How did it make you feel? Did it lead you to deeper trust in Him, or did it cause confusion and doubt? I want you to reflect on that moment. Was it a time when you were able to wait on God, or did you find yourself questioning your faith? This video will help you understand why God sometimes seems silent, and how His silence is never a sign of His absence. Instead, it's a powerful reminder that He is working behind the scenes in ways that we may not always understand. Stay with me, and let's explore this together, how silence can be one of God's most profound ways of communicating with us and preparing us for the greater purpose He has for our lives. If you've ever been in a season of silence, or are going through one right now, I encourage you to like and subscribe, and join me in the next video as we dive deeper into how God uses silence to refine our faith and guide us toward His will. At times in our lives, we may feel as though God is silent. We may pray fervently, seek answers, and wait for guidance, yet God's response seems absent or delayed. It's easy to confuse God's silence with His absence, but in reality, silence does not mean that God is distant or uninvolved. God's silence is not a sign that He has abandoned us. Rather, it is a moment in which He is still very much present, working in ways that we may not immediately understand or perceive. Silence, when it comes to God, can be seen as an opportunity for a deeper connection and relationship with Him. Silence is often used by God as a way of deepening our relationship with Him. When we don't hear a clear response from God, it can lead us to search within ourselves, to question our beliefs, and to seek Him with even greater intentionality. Silence pushes us out of our comfort zones, inviting us to trust Him more deeply, even when we cannot immediately hear His voice. It's a reminder that God is working in us, refining our faith, and drawing us closer to His heart, even if we don't hear His voice in the way we expect. God uses silence to help us learn to listen more attentively, to develop patience, and to trust in His timing. Silence encourages us to strengthen our faith, not in the momentary experiences we have with God, but in His eternal presence and promises. This type of silence is not a retreat from God, but a way in which He invites us to seek Him more earnestly, to deepen our trust, and to learn to rest in His presence, even when we don't have all the answers. The Bible is filled with examples where God used periods of silence to test and strengthen the faith of His people. A clear example of this is the time between the Old and New Testaments. often referred to as the 400 years of silence. After the prophet Malachi, there was a long period where no prophetic voice was heard in Israel. God remained silent, and during this time, Israel experienced significant challenges, including the domination of various empires. This time of silence was a test for the Jewish people, a way for God to prepare them for the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. This period of silence wasn't a punishment or abandonment, but rather a divine pause. During these years, the Jewish people experienced spiritual longing, waiting, and hoping for the fulfillment of God's promises. It was in this silence that they learned to trust in God's timing and anticipate the fulfillment of His plan. The silence ultimately set the stage for the most significant event in human history: the coming of Jesus Christ, the Savior. Another powerful example of divine silence can be found in the book of Job. Job, a man who was deeply faithful to God, faced intense suffering and loss. He was silent before God for much of his trials, with no clear answers or response from God. In Job 30-20, he cries out, "I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me." Job's suffering was great, and yet God did not immediately provide answers or explanations. In this silence, Job's faith was tested, and he was forced to grapple with the mystery of God's will. Job's silence and the absence of God's immediate response were pivotal moments in his spiritual journey. It was through this silence that Job ultimately grew in humility, trust, and a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty. By the end of the book, Job had a new level of intimacy with God, having seen Him in a way he hadn't before. God's silence led Job to a place of greater spiritual depth and greater trust in God's wisdom, even when answers weren't immediately apparent. Jesus' own life provides another example of God's silence. On the cross, as Jesus bore the weight of the world's sins, He cried out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27-46. For a moment, even Jesus experienced what felt like divine silence. God's silence during this pivotal moment was not an indication of abandonment, but a fulfillment of His greater plan. Jesus' silence was part of the ultimate expression of sacrifice and redemption for humanity. These biblical stories reveal that God's silence is not a sign of abandonment. Rather, it is often a moment where He is preparing us for something greater, refining our faith, and inviting us to trust in His eternal plan, even when we don't understand the immediate circumstances. There are several reasons why God may seem silent at times, each of which contributes to our spiritual growth and deeper understanding of His purpose for our lives. Some of the key reasons for God's silence include: sometimes, God allows us to go through times of silence to strengthen our faith. Faith is developed not when everything is clear and easy, but when we are tested and challenged. Just as a muscle grows stronger through resistance, our faith grows when it is tested. Silence forces us to rely not on immediate answers, but on trust in God's character and faithfulness. It's in these moments that we must choose to believe that God is present, even when we cannot perceive Him. Silence encourages us to dig deeper and seek a closer relationship with God. When God is silent, we are often prompted to look inward, search the Scriptures, and examine our own hearts. It's during these times that we may feel an urge to spend more time in prayer, reflection, and worship, which brings us closer to understanding God's will. God's silence isn't a rejection, it's an invitation to seek and knock, trusting that when we seek Him with our whole hearts, He will reveal Himself. Sometimes God uses silence to help us draw closer to Him. In our busy lives, we often get caught up in external distractions, and we may forget to spend time with God. Silence allows us to step away from the noise and focus on the stillness of God's presence. During these times, God invites us to reconnect with Him in a deeper way, to trust Him without the need for constant reassurance. It is in these quiet moments that we can feel His love and peace in a way that isn't dependent on answers, but on relationship. God's silence teaches us patience. We live in a world that values instant gratification, where everything is at our fingertips. But God's timing is different. Sometimes, He remains silent to teach us the virtue of waiting, trusting that in due time, He will reveal His plan. During this waiting period, we are called to endure with faith, knowing that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our expectations. Silence can also bring us to a place of humility. In our struggle with silence, we are reminded that we are not in control and that we must rely on God's sovereignty. It forces us to acknowledge that we cannot always understand God's ways, but we trust that He is good and that His plans are for our ultimate good. Through silence, we learn to surrender and trust in God's wisdom. In this section, we've explored the concept of God's silence and why it is such an essential part of our spiritual journey. God's silence is not His absence. It is an opportunity for growth, deepening of faith, and personal transformation. Through times of silence, God is often working in us, preparing us for greater things, and teaching us to trust in His timing and plan. Whether through biblical examples or our personal experiences, we see that silence is often a tool God uses to refine and shape us into who He created us to be. Let us embrace the silence and trust that God is always present, even when His voice is not immediately heard. One of the most profound aspects of God's silence is that it gives us an opportunity to pause and reflect on our lives. In the busyness of life, it's easy to get caught up in our daily routines, distractions, and immediate concerns. We may find ourselves focusing on everything around us, yet neglecting the deeper, more important aspects of our spiritual journey. God's silence, in this context, is not an absence, but an invitation to slow down, reassess, and reconnect with Him on a deeper level. When God seems silent, it is an invitation to take a step back and examine our relationship with Him. Silence gives us the space to evaluate where we stand spiritually, to reflect on our faith, and to consider how we've been growing in our walk with God. This period of quiet allows us to move beyond the noise of daily life and be more intentional about our connection with God. It's during these times that we can look inward and ask ourselves important questions. Are we truly trusting in God's plan for our lives? Are we relying on His guidance, or are we leaning on our own understanding? God's silence calls us to evaluate our hearts and our actions, helping us to realign our lives with His will. The silence of God often serves as a catalyst for deeper intimacy. As we sit quietly in His presence, we begin to sense His love, peace, and presence more clearly. Silence offers us a space where we can hear God's gentle voice and reflect on His character and promises. This deeper relationship, cultivated in the quiet moments of life, brings about a new understanding of God's heart for us. We begin to see Him not just as a provider of answers, but as our constant companion, our refuge, and our guide. In the silence, we find a place of rest in God's love and a renewal of our commitment to Him. Another significant benefit of God's silence is that it teaches us to trust God more deeply. When we are faced with silence, we are forced to place our trust in God's timing and plans, even when we don't receive immediate answers to our prayers or requests. God's silence is not a sign of neglect, but a test of our faith. In moments when we can't hear His voice or sense His presence, it challenges us to rely on what we know to be true about God, that He is always present, always working behind the scenes, and always faithful to fulfill His promises. Trusting God in silence requires us to go beyond the superficial desire for quick answers. It challenges us to trust in His sovereignty and wisdom, acknowledging that He knows the perfect time and way to respond to our prayers. This is especially difficult because, as humans, we often desire instant results. We want to see our prayers answered right away, but God's silence teaches us the importance of waiting, patience, and perseverance in our spiritual journey. In the silence, we are forced to surrender our own timelines and trust that God's plans are better than our own. This act of surrender is a critical part of our spiritual growth. It shows that we are willing to let go of our need for control and trust that God is guiding us, even when we can't see the full picture. As we wait in silence, our trust in God is deepened, and we learn to rest in His promises rather than relying on our own understanding or timelines. This trust is not just about waiting for an answer. It's about trusting in God's wisdom and perfect timing, knowing that He will respond when the time is right. A powerful example of how God's silence can lead to spiritual growth and deepen trust is found in the story of Abraham. In Genesis 12, God made a bold promise to Abraham. He would make him the father of a great nation. Despite this profound promise, Abraham waited for many years before seeing any sign of fulfillment. There was a long period of silence between God's promise and its fulfillment, a silence that tested Abraham's faith. At times, it must have seemed like God had forgotten His promise to Abraham. For 25 years, Abraham waited for the child that God had promised would come. Throughout this period of waiting, there were moments of doubt and questioning. Abraham even tried to take matters into his own hands, as seen in the story of Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 16, where he and Sarah took a shortcut to fulfill God's promise through their own efforts. However, despite these attempts, God's silence remained. God did not act until Abraham had learned to fully trust in God's plan and timing. The silence was not God's absence, but a test and a means of spiritual growth. It was during this time of waiting that Abraham's faith deepened, and he began to trust in God's timing rather than his own. God used this long season of silence to help Abraham relinquish control, learning to trust God fully, even when the promise seemed far off. And then, at the appointed time, God fulfilled His promise, and Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah. This was the moment when the waiting, the silence, and the testing of faith came to fruition. Abraham's faith, strengthened by years of trusting in God during silence, led to the fulfillment of God's divine plan. This story reminds us that even when God is silent, He is still at work. He uses silence as a tool to mature our faith, teach us patience, and prepare us for the fulfillment of His promises. Just like Abraham, we may have to wait, but we can rest in the knowledge that God's timing is always perfect, and He is always working behind the scenes, even when we don't see immediate results. In this section, we've explored how silence can serve as a tool for spiritual growth. It provides us with a moment to reflect, reassess our relationship with God, and learn to trust in His perfect timing and plans. God's silence is not a sign of abandonment, but a way for Him to deepen our faith, teach us patience, and lead us closer to Him. Through biblical examples like Abraham, we see that silence can be the very means by which God prepares us for greater purposes. In the silence, we learn to trust God more deeply, waiting in faith for the fulfillment of His promises. Let us embrace those moments of silence and trust that God is working in us and through us, even when we can't hear or see Him directly. In our spiritual journey, there are moments when God's silence can feel overwhelming. We pray, seek guidance, and pour our hearts out to Him, yet there are times when He doesn't respond immediately, leaving us to wonder if He is truly listening. God's silence is not a sign of abandonment, but a profound test of our faith. Just as a teacher may remain silent during an exam, allowing the student to work independently, God sometimes allows us to experience silence to see how much we trust in Him. It's during these moments that our faith is tested, not by the lack of an answer, but by our willingness to trust in God's wisdom and timing. Even when we cannot see or understand the outcome, faith in God doesn't rely on immediate answers or visible signs. Faith is about trusting in God's character and promises, even when His voice seems silent. When God remains silent, He isn't absent, He is present, allowing us to experience a deeper level of trust. Our faith grows when we must rely on the unseen, when we choose to believe that God is still working, even in the quiet. God's silence challenges us to believe in His sovereignty, that He is in control, and that His plan for us is greater than we can comprehend in the moment. The role of faith in silence is vital because it shifts our perspective. It moves us from doubt and frustration into a place of trust, where we acknowledge that God knows better than we do. Faith in silence doesn't mean we stop seeking answers, or that we shouldn't feel the pain of not hearing from God. Rather, it means that in the silence, we choose to rest in His wisdom and trust His perfect timing, understanding that His silence is also part of His communication with us. It is an invitation to deepen our relationship with Him, relying on His promises, even when we don't have immediate answers. One of the most powerful expressions of faith during silence is found in the book of Psalms, specifically in Psalm 22:1, where David cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This verse is one of the most poignant examples of feeling abandoned by God, yet still expressing a deep belief in His presence and purpose. David's cry represents the profound agony of feeling that God is silent during his time of trial. David, a man after God's own heart, experienced periods of intense silence from God, particularly when he was fleeing from King Saul, facing the betrayal of his friends, or enduring personal hardship. What is remarkable about Psalm 22:1 is that David's cry, though filled with anguish and doubt, is still directed to God. David's experience was one of intense suffering, and he felt as if God had withdrawn His presence. Yet, in his pain, he did not turn away from God. Instead, he poured out his heart in the form of a desperate cry for help, but in doing so, he affirmed that God was still his refuge, even in the silence. David's experience demonstrates that even in silence, faith is expressed. Faith is not just about hearing God's voice, but about continuing to call out to Him, trusting that He hears us even when we don't receive an immediate response. Moreover, David's cry is not a sign of weak faith, but of authenticity in his relationship with God. God allows us to express our frustrations, doubts, and confusion. He doesn't expect us to hide our emotions or our struggles. Like David, we are invited to bring our pain and questions before God, trusting that He can handle our raw emotions. God's silence does not mean He is ignoring us. It means that He is allowing us the space to wrestle with our faith and to come to a place of deeper trust. David's continued trust in God's presence, despite his feelings of abandonment, shows the true strength of his faith. David's cry from Psalm 22, later quoted by Jesus on the cross, also foreshadows the ultimate moment of divine silence in human history. Jesus, too, cried out to God from the cross, expressing the feeling of abandonment, yet trusting in the Father's plan even in the deepest silence. Jesus' cry on the cross resonates with David's words, reinforcing the idea that silence in moments of suffering doesn't mean God is absent. Rather, it is often in silence that God's deepest work is being accomplished, even when we cannot see it. God's silence often serves as a means of building perseverance. During periods of silence, our faith is stretched and tested. It's easy to follow God when everything seems clear, and His answers come quickly. But when silence prevails, it challenges us to continue walking in faith, despite the absence of visible evidence. Perseverance is built during these silent moments, as we are called to trust in God's faithfulness, even when our circumstances don't match our expectations. The Apostle James writes in James 1:3-4, "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." God's silence is not a reason for us to give up, it's a call to persevere. Silence does not mean that God has forgotten us. It means that He is working in ways we may not yet understand. Perseverance during God's silence builds a resilient faith that remains steadfast, even in difficult circumstances. Abraham's story provides a vivid example of perseverance in the face of silence. When God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, Abraham was already an old man, and his wife, Sarah, was beyond childbearing age. Despite this, God's silence lasted for 25 years before His promise was fulfilled. Abraham had to trust God throughout this long period of silence. His faith wasn't perfected when God gave him the promise. It was perfected during the years of waiting and trusting in the unseen. Abraham learned to persevere in faith, even when the promise seemed impossible. And God's silence was the means by which Abraham's faith was strengthened. God's silence builds spiritual endurance. When we encounter silence, we often face a choice: to trust in God's timing or to give up. Perseverance is the ability to stay faithful even when the situation is unclear. It is about continuing to seek God, praying and trusting, even when we don't see immediate answers. This endurance is the foundation of mature faith, one that is not dependent on the immediate fulfillment of our desires, but on the steady trust that God is always working for our good. In this section, we've examined how God's silence serves as a test of our faith. Just as a teacher remains silent during an exam to test a student's knowledge, God's silence tests our trust in His character and His plan for our lives. Like David, who cried out in anguish but still expressed faith in God's presence, we too are called to trust in God even when we cannot hear or understand Him. Silence is a tool for building perseverance, challenging us to keep walking in faith even when the path ahead is unclear. Let us remember that God's silence is not abandonment. It is an invitation to trust more deeply, to persevere, and to grow in our faith, knowing that God is always at work, even in the quiet moments. When we encounter moments of God's silence, it's easy to become discouraged or to feel as though He is distant or inactive. We may wonder why we aren't receiving answers to our prayers or guidance when we need it most. However, it's important to understand that God's silence does not indicate His absence or inactivity. In fact, God may be working behind the scenes in ways we cannot yet perceive. While we might be looking for immediate responses or visible signs of action, God is often orchestrating events and working in hidden ways that will eventually reveal His perfect plan. When God is silent, He is actively working, just in ways that are often beyond our understanding. He may be aligning circumstances, preparing the hearts of others, or opening doors that we cannot see from our current vantage point. God's work in the silence often involves invisible preparation, the preparation of people, situations, and timing, so that His plan can unfold in the perfect way. Silence is part of God's providential care, and though we may not immediately recognize it, He is still accomplishing His will. In the book of Esther, we see how God's providence was at work. Even though His name is not mentioned throughout the entire book, God was quietly orchestrating events behind the scenes to protect the Jewish people from destruction. And when Esther stood before King Xerxes, the full extent of God's hidden work was revealed. Esther did not see the full plan in the moment, but God had been preparing her for such a time as that. Esther 4:14. This is an example of how God is always at work, even when we don't see or hear Him actively responding to our prayers. His silence is not absence. It is part of the way He moves to fulfill His purpose in ways that only He can orchestrate. Providence refers to God's continuous involvement in creation, where He governs and sustains all things according to His divine will and purpose. Even in times of silence, God is actively guiding events and situations in a way that aligns with His perfect plan for our lives. We may not always see how it is unfolding, but God's providence assures us that He is at work, preparing us for what lies ahead. His silence allows time for things to align not just in our lives, but also in the world around us. God's silence may be the necessary pause that gives His plan space to unfold. Much like a gardener who plants seeds and patiently waits for them to grow, God may be allowing time for things to develop, relationships to grow, or circumstances to align for a greater purpose. In the silence, God is working out His plan, even when we can't yet perceive the full picture. The book of Habakkuk offers a powerful example of how God's providence unfolds in silence. Habakkuk is troubled by the apparent prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous. He asks God why He allows injustice to flourish. God responds by saying that He is working in ways that Habakkuk cannot understand. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come, and will not delay. Habakkuk 2-3. This was a moment of divine silence for the prophet, a time when God's plan was hidden from view. Yet, God's providence was at work behind the scenes, setting things in motion for his perfect timing. His silence allowed for the unfolding of events that would eventually reveal God's righteousness and justice. God's providence, in silence, also teaches us to wait with patience and trust in his sovereignty. We may not always see how things are aligning or understand why God is silent, but we can rest assured that he is actively working. His silence is a space where his plan is slowly unfolding, in ways that are often beyond our human understanding. We must trust his timing, knowing that everything is happening according to his divine purpose. One of the most profound examples of God's hidden work in silence is seen in the life of Jesus Christ, particularly during the days leading up to his trial and crucifixion. Before his death on the cross, there were significant moments where Jesus was silent, and this silence was a key part of God's providential plan. In Matthew 27-12:1-4, we see Jesus standing before Pilate, the Roman governor, who asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus remains silent, despite being accused by the chief priests and elders. Pilate is amazed by this silence, especially because he knows Jesus has been accused of serious crimes. This silence is significant because it fulfills Isaiah 53-7, which prophesies that the Messiah would be led like a sheep to the slaughter, and that he would remain silent before his accusers. Jesus' silence, in this case, was not a sign of weakness or defeat, but a deliberate act of submission to God's plan of salvation. It was in his silence that Jesus was carrying out the will of God, fulfilling the purpose for which he came into the world to give his life for the sins of humanity. God's silence during Jesus' crucifixion also reveals the greatest example of divine providence. During the darkest moment of human history, when Jesus hung on the cross, God seemed silent. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27-46. But even in that moment of silence, God was working in the most powerful way. The silence on the cross marked the moment of greatest victory. Jesus' death and subsequent resurrection would provide the ultimate salvation for all humanity. God's silence was not a sign of abandonment. It was part of the divine plan for redemption. Jesus' silence in the face of injustice and suffering highlights the truth that God is often at work in the hidden places, fulfilling his greater purpose even when we do not understand the situation. The ultimate redemption came through a period of silence and suffering, and in that silence, God was accomplishing the work of salvation. Just as God was silent during Jesus' trial and crucifixion, he is still working behind the scenes in our lives, even when we cannot see or hear him. In this section, we have explored how God's silence is not a sign of inactivity. God's silence is often a moment where he is working behind the scenes, preparing the circumstances, people, and timing for his greater plan. Just as God was working providentially during the periods of silence in the Bible, he is working in our lives today, even when we don't hear his voice or see his hand directly. Through Jesus' silence before his trial and crucifixion, we are reminded that God's silence often accompanies his greatest works, those that require us to trust him even when we cannot immediately see the results. Just as Jesus' silence before his accusers was part of God's plan for salvation, we too must trust that God is at work in the quiet moments of our lives, preparing us for something greater. One of the most challenging, yet rewarding, aspects of our relationship with God is learning to wait on him. Waiting can often feel uncomfortable, especially in a world that values speed and instant gratification. Yet, in the context of our spiritual journey, waiting is one of the most powerful tools God uses to shape our character, deepen our trust, and prepare us for his divine plan. Psalm 46:10 invites us to be still and know that I am God. This verse emphasizes that stillness and waiting are not passive actions, but rather, they are active acts of trust and spiritual surrender. When God asks us to wait, He is not leaving us in a state of limbo or neglect. Instead, He is calling us to pause, reflect, and allow His perfect timing to unfold. Silence and stillness are opportunities to experience God in a deeper way, not by rushing to the next thing, but by being present with Him in the moment. In our busy lives, filled with noise, distractions, and constant activity, it can be difficult to hear God's voice or perceive His direction. But when we choose to be still, we are creating space for God to speak to us and for His plan to take shape within us. The stillness mentioned in Psalm 46:10 is not simply the absence of external noise. It is the deliberate act of trusting God's sovereignty and waiting for His timing. It is a reminder that in the midst of silence, God is working, and that we can find peace in His presence even when we don't yet have answers. Waiting on God teaches us to depend on His strength, trusting that He will act when the time is right. Our trust grows as we wait in faith, acknowledging that God knows what is best for us and that His timing is always perfect. In a world filled with distractions, the practice of stillness is essential for our spiritual growth. In fact, stillness and silence are often regarded as spiritual disciplines, practices that help us cultivate a deeper connection with God. Silence is a tool for personal reflection, prayer, and listening to God's voice. When we embrace stillness, we are creating an environment where we can hear God's guidance more clearly, free from the noise and demands of our everyday lives. Stillness allows us to quiet our hearts and minds so that we can focus on God without distraction. Mark 1:35 tells us that, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where He prayed. Even Jesus, during His earthly ministry, sought out moments of solitude and stillness to connect with the Father. This practice was integral to His spiritual life and provided Him with the strength and clarity He needed to fulfill His mission. Stillness is not just about being quiet, it's about listening. In times of silence, God can speak to us in ways that are not possible when we are consumed by external noise. Whether through the gentle whisper of the Holy Spirit, the words of Scripture, or the peace that passes understanding, stillness creates a space for God to reveal Himself and His will. When we learn to be still and wait on God, we open ourselves up to deeper understanding and greater intimacy with Him. In addition to listening to God's voice, stillness can also become a time for personal reflection. In the quiet, we are able to examine our own hearts and lives, asking God to reveal areas where we need growth, healing, or transformation. Silence allows us to bring our burdens before God and receive His peace, comfort, and guidance. Just as the psalmist says in Psalm 62:1, "My soul finds rest in God alone." Stillness allows our souls to rest in God's presence, where we find renewal and strength. While stillness and waiting can seem challenging, there are practical ways to incorporate these practices into our spiritual lives. Learning to be still and wait on God requires intentionality and commitment. Here are some suggestions for how you can embrace stillness in your own spiritual journey. Begin your day with intentional quiet time. Choose a time and place where you can be free from distractions and spend time in prayer, reflection, and listening. This could be first thing in the morning or during the evening when you can shut off the busyness of the day. Set aside at least 10 to 15 minutes to be still before God, allowing Him to speak into your heart. Start by acknowledging His presence, and then sit in silence, trusting that He will guide your thoughts and prayers. Meditation on God's Word is a powerful way to practice stillness. Take a verse or passage from the Bible and meditate on it throughout the day. Rather than rushing to the next chapter, spend time thinking deeply about how God is speaking to you through those words. Ask God to reveal new insights and meaning as you meditate on His truth. Psalm 1:2-3 speaks about the blessed man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on His law he meditates day and night. Meditation on Scripture invites us to be still and allow God's Word to transform our hearts. Mindfulness is the practice of being fully present in the moment, focusing your attention on the here and now. When praying, focus solely on the act of connecting with God. Let go of your worries, thoughts, and distractions, and simply be present with Him. You can begin by practicing deep breathing, inviting God's presence into your time of prayer. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still, and know that I am God." This stillness is the mindfulness of being in His presence, allowing Him to bring peace and clarity into your mind and heart. If possible, create a designated area in your home or elsewhere where you can regularly retreat to for quiet time. This space should be free from distractions, a place that invites stillness and reflection. Whether it's a quiet corner, a prayer bench, or a nature walk, find a space where you can be alone with God. Having a physical place to retreat to can make stillness a natural part of your daily routine. In a world full of noise, we can often feel uncomfortable in silence. However, embracing silence is key to growing in our ability to hear God. Whether you're sitting in nature, driving in your car, or simply sitting quietly at home, take moments to embrace silence. Resist the urge to fill every moment with music, conversation, or entertainment. Instead, allow yourself to be still and listen for God's voice, trusting that in the silence, He will speak to you. Writing down your thoughts and reflections during times of stillness is another way to connect with God. As you spend time being still, write down your prayers, the insights God gives you, and your feelings about the season you're in. Journaling helps you track your spiritual growth and gives you a space to process your thoughts. It can also help you reflect on God's silence and how He might be working in the quiet moments. In this section, we have discussed how stillness and waiting are vital aspects of our spiritual walk with God. Through stillness, we learn to trust God's timing and experience His presence in ways that we often miss in the busyness of life. Silence is not just the absence of sound. It is a space for reflection, prayer, and deeper intimacy with God. By setting aside intentional time for stillness, we allow God to speak to us more clearly and open our hearts to His guidance. As we wait on God, we grow in patience and perseverance, learning to trust His plan for our lives. Let us embrace stillness and incorporate it into our daily rhythms, knowing that in those quiet moments, God is working in us and through us. At times, when God seems silent, we might feel abandoned, overlooked, or disconnected from His presence. These feelings are natural, especially when we are in need or facing difficult circumstances. However, God's silence is not a sign of rejection, nor is it an indication that He has turned away from us. Rather, it can be a profound invitation to draw closer to Him. Silence can be a divine opportunity to cultivate a deeper, more authentic relationship with God, where we seek Him not for immediate answers, but for His presence and love. In many spiritual traditions, silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a sacred space, where we encounter God in a way that words cannot fully express. When God is silent, He may be inviting us to grow closer, to seek Him more earnestly, and to be more attentive to His voice. In moments of silence, we have the chance to learn that God is not only found in the loud, dramatic moments of life, but also in the quiet and stillness of our hearts. God desires a relationship with us that goes beyond asking for things or seeking answers to prayers. He longs for us to desire Him for who He is, not just for what He can give us. The silence we experience may be the very space that allows us to rediscover God's presence in a new, more intimate way. As we wait and seek Him without distraction, we find that He draws nearer to us, often revealing aspects of His character that we had not known before. Silence can also serve as a gentle invitation to become more intentional in our spiritual practices. It calls us to slow down, to still our hearts, and to focus solely on God, not as a distant figure but as a loving Father who desires to meet us in the quiet moments. God's silence often leads to a deeper intimacy with Him. In our busy lives, it can be easy to rely on noise and activity to mask our feelings of discomfort or unease. But in silence, we are often forced to confront our hearts and longings in a way that leads to spiritual growth. Silence can push us to search for God more earnestly, to pray more fervently, and to desire His presence with greater sincerity. When God is silent, we may initially feel discouraged or disheartened, wondering why He is not responding to our cries. However, it is in those quiet moments that we are often invited to go deeper in our spiritual walk. Just as a relationship deepens through time spent together, even in the absence of words, so too does our relationship with God grow when we allow space for silence. This period of waiting and seeking can cultivate a greater longing for God's presence. We might find ourselves praying longer or more intently, not because we are seeking answers, but because we simply want to be with God. God's silence is an invitation to enter into a place of rest where we can experience His love and peace in ways that go beyond the surface level of our spiritual lives. In silence, we learn to be with God, not just to ask from Him or talk at Him. It teaches us the beauty of quiet moments spent in His presence, where we are reminded that God is more concerned with our relationship with Him than with our immediate needs. The silence also calls us to a deeper awareness of God's movement in our lives. In the stillness, we can become more attuned to the subtleties of His presence. Often, we expect God's presence to be loud, dramatic, or immediately noticeable. But in silence, God teaches us to recognize Him in the quiet, in the gentle nudges of the Holy Spirit, and in the still, small voice that speaks to our hearts. The intimacy we find in the silence is an intimacy that transcends our circumstances and our desires, as it is rooted in the simple truth of God's constant presence with us. One of the most profound examples in Scripture of how silence can lead to deeper intimacy with God is found in the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb. In 1 Kings 19:11-1-2, Elijah, feeling alone and afraid, goes to Mount Horeb in search of God. He encounters a series of powerful natural events: a wind, an earthquake, and a fire. Yet, the Bible tells us that God was not present in any of these dramatic events. Instead, after the fire, Elijah heard a gentle whisper, and it was in this whisper that God's presence was revealed to him. This story is a beautiful reminder that God's presence is not always found in the loud, obvious moments, but often in the quiet, still spaces where we are willing to listen. Elijah, a prophet who had witnessed dramatic displays of God's power, including calling down fire from heaven, 1 Kings 18:36-39, had to learn that God's voice and presence could also be found in the quiet. It was in the silence that God's true intimacy was revealed, and Elijah's relationship with God deepened in a profound way. God's whisper to Elijah shows us that spiritual intimacy often arises in the most unexpected ways. While we may long for God to act decisively and visibly in our lives, He often uses silence to draw us nearer to Him. The silence allows us to experience God's presence in a deeper, more personal way than in the noise of our everyday lives. The whisper is an invitation to a more intimate relationship with God, one where we can hear His voice in the midst of our waiting and seeking. Elijah's experience shows that God often works in ways that challenge our expectations. While we might anticipate that God will act powerfully and loudly in our lives, we must be open to the possibility that He may be speaking in the quietest of moments, waiting for us to listen and be present with Him. In this section, we've explored how God's silence can be a call to a deeper relationship with Him. Silence is not a sign of abandonment or rejection. It is a sacred space where God invites us to seek Him more earnestly, pray more fervently, and experience His presence more deeply. Just as Elijah found God in the still, small whisper, we too are invited into moments of quiet reflection where we can hear God's voice with greater clarity. God's silence is an opportunity to deepen our spiritual intimacy and grow in our trust and dependence on Him. May we embrace these moments of silence as a calling to draw closer to God, trusting that even in the quiet, He is always present, always near, and always working to draw us into a deeper relationship with Him. One of the most challenging aspects of our spiritual journey is learning to trust in God's timing, especially when it feels like He is silent. Silence can feel like a void, a space where we are unsure of what God is doing or why He isn't responding to our prayers. But God's silence does not indicate that He is absent or inactive. On the contrary, His silence is often part of a larger divine plan where He is preparing us for something greater, something that, in His perfect timing, will be revealed. We often try to hurry God's plan, wanting answers and breakthroughs on our own terms. However, God's timing is never wrong, and it is always perfectly aligned with His will for our lives. His silence during times of waiting does not mean He has forgotten us, but rather that He is allowing things to unfold in the right moment. Trusting God's timing requires us to let go of our own expectations and surrender to the knowledge that His plan is far greater than our own. In Ecclesiastes 3:1, we are reminded that there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. This verse teaches us that every moment, every season of silence, and every delay has a divine purpose. God is never late. His timing is always perfect, and always for our good and His glory. We may not understand the waiting period, but if we trust that God knows best, we can find peace in the waiting, knowing that He is orchestrating everything for our ultimate benefit. God uses silence not just to test our faith, but to prepare us for what is to come. His silence helps us focus on His plan rather than our own desires and allows us to reflect on how we can grow during this waiting period. God's timing ensures that His purposes are fulfilled perfectly at just the right moment, when we are ready to receive what He has in store for us. A profound biblical example of God's perfect timing is found in the story of Sarah and Abraham. In Genesis 18, God promised Abraham that he would have a son, even though Sarah was well past childbearing age. God's promise to Abraham seemed impossible, especially given the years of waiting. In Genesis 17, Abraham even laughed at the idea, considering Sarah's age and his own. However, God's timing was different from theirs, and He had a plan that would unfold at just the right moment. Sarah's wait for a child exemplifies the long periods of silence we can experience in our own lives. For years, Abraham and Sarah waited. They prayed, hoped, and longed for God's promise to be fulfilled, but the silence seemed endless. In the silence, they may have questioned God's promise, wondering if it would ever come true. Yet, despite the long wait, God was never absent. He was at work, preparing them for the fulfillment of His promise, but in a way that would demonstrate His power and sovereignty. Finally, in Genesis 21:1-2, God's promise was fulfilled. Sarah bore a son, Isaac, at exactly the right time. The long wait was not in vain. God's timing was perfect. Isaac was not just a child of Abraham and Sarah. He was the fulfillment of a divine promise that would bless the nations. Through Isaac, God's covenant with Abraham would continue, and His plan would unfold. Sarah's waiting period was not an indication of God's silence in the sense of abandonment. Rather, it was a preparation for the arrival of the promise that would change the course of history. This story serves as a powerful reminder that God's silence is not a sign of abandonment, but an opportunity for us to trust in His timing. Just as Sarah's waiting was a preparation for the incredible promise of Isaac, our times of waiting and silence may be moments when God is preparing us for the fulfillment of His promises. The silence often allows us to reflect, build our faith, and strengthen our trust in His ability to fulfill His word at the right time. In our own lives, we will undoubtedly experience times when God seems silent. Whether we're waiting for healing, direction, breakthrough, or a promise to be fulfilled, it's important to understand that God is still at work even when we don't see it. God's silence is never empty. It is always filled with purpose. He is using the waiting period to refine us, grow our faith, and prepare us for what's ahead. When we feel that God is silent, we may be tempted to doubt His presence or question His goodness, but these moments of silence are opportunities for growth and trust. God is inviting us to embrace His timing and to believe that He is orchestrating everything in our lives for His glory and our good. Just as Abraham and Sarah had to trust God's timing, even when it didn't make sense, we too must learn to wait with hope and expectancy. God's timing is perfect, and the waiting we experience is not meant to cause frustration or discouragement, but to strengthen our trust in Him. Silence is part of the journey, a space in which God shapes us into people who are ready to receive His promises. To embrace God's silence, we must surrender our desire for control and trust that He will act at the right time. Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. This means that even in times of silence, we can trust that God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for what He has planned. His silence does not mean He is not listening or that He has forgotten us. It simply means He is allowing the right conditions to form in His perfect timing. We may not know when or how God will answer our prayers or fulfill His promises, but we can trust that His silence is part of His greater plan. Each moment of waiting is an invitation to grow closer to Him, to develop a deeper trust, and to rely on His wisdom rather than our own. In this section, we have explored the importance of embracing God's timing in moments of silence. Silence is not an indication of God's absence, but rather a tool used by God to develop our faith, refine our trust, and prepare us for what lies ahead. The story of Sarah and Abraham reminds us that God's perfect timing always results in the fulfillment of His promises. Even if it takes longer than we expect, God's silence is an opportunity for us to grow, trust, and wait on His perfect timing, knowing that He is at work even when we cannot see it. In times of silence, we can find peace in knowing that God's plan is unfolding in ways we might not yet understand. Trusting God's silence and embracing the waiting period is an act of faith, one that will lead us to deeper intimacy with Him and ultimately to the fulfillment of His perfect will. Let us embrace His timing and be confident that, just as He did for Sarah, He will come through for us at the right moment, fulfilling His promises in ways that are beyond our imagination. As we come to the close of this discussion, it's important to remember that God's silence is not a sign of His absence or neglect, but rather a purposeful part of His divine plan for us. His silence is an invitation to draw closer to Him, to develop patience, and to strengthen our faith. It is in those quiet moments that we are often called to trust God more deeply, to reflect on His goodness, and to prepare ourselves for the next phase of our spiritual journey. While it can be difficult and uncomfortable to experience silence, we must recognize that God uses it to refine us, purify us, and prepare us for the greater things He has in store. His silence often indicates that He is working behind the scenes, shaping us, molding our hearts, and helping us grow in faith and character. In moments when God seems silent, it's essential to embrace the understanding that He is still present with us, even when we don't hear His voice or see immediate results. God's silence is never abandonment. In fact, it's often a period of preparation, a time when He is doing His greatest work in our lives, even if we don't see it right away. Trusting in God's silence requires patience and faith, knowing that He is leading us towards something greater, something we may not fully understand yet, but that will ultimately fulfill His purpose for us. So, in those times when it feels like God is silent, let us choose to trust His presence and believe in His perfect timing. We are not alone. God is at work, even in the quiet, preparing us for what lies ahead. Thank you for taking the time to reflect with us on this important aspect of our spiritual journey. As you go about your week, I encourage you to think about the periods of silence in your life. Instead of feeling abandoned or confused, recognize that these moments are often preparing you for greater things. God is at work, shaping your character, building your faith, and getting you ready for the next chapter of your journey. If you found this message helpful, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who may also benefit from this reminder of God's presence in the silence. And, as we continue this journey of faith together, I invite you to join us in the next video, where we'll explore more about growing in faith, trusting God's ways, and understanding His timing. Thank you once again for being part of this journey, and remember, even in the silence, God is working. Keep trusting Him. Keep waiting patiently. Your story is still unfolding, and His plans for you are far greater than you can imagine. See you in the next video,